May our object be, like MacDonald's and antiphon, to erect in this place, in his words, a spot of concentrated hearing where our hearts may listen and join in the song of gathered fellows. Now the first song, the first fellow, that we have the delight of listening to today is Danny Gabelman. Danny, like a few others you will meet this weekend, there's a few of us kicking about, earned his PhD at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, at the Institute of Theology, Imagination and the Arts, an institute imagined into being and co-founded by another one of our keynotes, Trevor Hart. Although a native of Colorado, Danny, he is a daddy. He's not my daddy, but he's an awesome daddy. I've seen him in action. He's an awesome daddy. Danny has lived in the UK for over a decade and a half now, where he is the head of English at King's Ely School, Cambridgeshire, as well as being a husband, a father, an uncle, and a friend. And as you may have guessed from his conference photo, the curator of a small holding. If you missed the picture of the cow online, take a look at that. Danny is the author of George MacDonald, Divine Carelessness and Fairy Tale Levity, and co-editor with Amanda Vernon, who's also here running around the room, just to draw attention to you, Amanda, of the just arrived and beautifully presented Unsaying the Commonplace. It's just been published. Unsaying the Commonplace, George MacDonald and the Critique of Convention. And you will see that this weekend. This all may sound very serious, but Danny is not always serious. And as his co-editing of the Cambridge series Doodles and Doodling might indicate. And apparently he could, for example, make John McNeill very happy, so I'm told, with his dab karaoke routine of Bob Dylan's Hey Mr. Tambourine Man. But tempting as that is, perhaps at the open mic on Friday, today Danny is going to commence our conversations, our delving deep, by pulling us into a closer look at MacDonald's absolutely seminal and foundational essay, the one from whence comes the conference title, The Imagination, Its Functions and Its Culture. I do first want to ask Danny a question that will be asked repeatedly throughout the conference, so you're going to hear this again, one that's so worth the asking. So Danny, I'll get you to come up and answer this so you have a mic, people can hear you. And that is, how did you first discover MacDonald? And what's something about him and his work that drew you in deeper?
So, like many people, I first found out about MacDonald through C.S. Lewis, and I don't remember which book, probably I'm Surprised by Joy. But I suppose the example that I often give is finding George MacDonald's fairy tales in a used bookshop in Roanoke, Virginia, and this one of those lovely old used bookshops which don't seem to be around as much anymore. And just amongst the treasures, I found the Penguin edition of MacDonald's fairy tales, and that was probably one of the things that did draw me in. And I'll say actually a little bit about that. Particularly the essay, The Fantastic Imagination, was one of the things that definitely drew me in.
Cool.
To George MacDonald.
Cool. That's not that typical. That's awesome. That's awesome. Okay, so thank you, Danny. Thank you all for being here. And we're going to leave Danny to now pull us in deeper to Playing with Prophecy, Imagining MacDonald's Imagination.
Right. Thank you very much, Kirsten. If everyone hopefully has their crayons, I'll explain a little bit later. But at the start of this Bicentenary Conference, celebrating the life and works of George MacDonald, I want to give everyone, including myself, maybe especially myself, an invitation. This invitation was one of MacDonald's constant summonses and exhortations to his readers and audiences. It is probably not an invitation that you are used to hearing at a plenary, at an academic conference, nor, sadly, is it an invitation that we hear very often at our universities, town halls, or perhaps most tragically, in our churches. All right, how do I build up the suspense? Here it is. Let us be children this conference. Let us grow a little more childlike in the next 3 days. Let us be playfellows in this game that we have come here to play. The game of imagining MacDonald's imagination. My inspiration for this invitation is the final passage of the essay Kirsten just mentioned, The Imagination, Its Function, and Its Cultures. And just before this extract, MacDonald is talking about how the imagination is not just for artists and for poets. And I think that's one of the most important things about this essay. Because he says, it is necessary that all should feel. It is necessary that all should understand and imagine the good. That all should begin, at least, to follow and find out God. The glory of God is to conceal a thing, but the glory of the king is to find it out, says Solomon. As if, remarks Francis Bacon on this passage, according to the innocent play of children, the divine majesty took delight to hide his words, to the end to have them found out, and as if kings could not obtain a greater honor than to be playfellows in that game. One more quotation from the book of Ecclesiastes, setting forth both the necessity we are under to imagine and the comfort that our imagining cannot outstrip God. I have seen the travail that which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised in it. He hath made everything beautiful in his time. Also he hath set the world in their heart, so that no man can find out the work that God maketh from the beginning to the end. Thus, to be playfellows with God in this game. The little ones may gather their daisies and follow their painted moths. The child of the kingdom may pour upon the lilies of the field and gather faith as the birds of the air their food from the leafless hawthorn, ruddy with the stores God has laid up for them. And the man of science may sit and rightly spell of every star that heaven doth show, and every herb that sips the dew, till old experience do attain to something like prophetic strain. I love this passage. It feels to me like the beating heart of MacDonald's imagination. I thought about spending my entire talk on an extremely close reading of this one passage. Although that would have been my delight, it might not have been yours. So instead, I thought maybe it would be a better idea to mark out the playground that MacDonald's prophetic imagination and gesture to the way that some of the other papers, plenaries, and panels are going to explore some of this territory in the next few days. And this is the reason, to my mind, the best way to do that was to explore this essay on the imagination. In this essay, MacDonald compares the work of art to a cathedral and says the main goal of a teacher should be to show the spiritual scaffolding or skeleton, those main ideas upon which the shape of the work of art is constructed. While he dwells with delight, as I would have liked to have done, on the relation of each peculiar arch to the meaning of the whole cathedral, he will not think it needless to explain the principles on which it is constructed. Neither yet will the tracery of its windows or the fretting of its moldings be forgotten. Every beauty will have its word. Only all beauties will be subordinated to the final beauty, that is, the unity of the whole. So, I will do my best, despite my inclination, to follow his advice and help us to imagine the spiritual scaffolding, or we might think of climbing frame to carry on the playful metaphor, of MacDonald's prophetic imagination, as articulated in this 1867 essay, The Imagination, Its Functions, and Its Culture. If, following MacDonald's playful architectural lead, we compare this essay to a cathedral, it would definitely be a Gothic cathedral. And Crystal Downing will be talking to us more about MacDonald's architectural imagination tomorrow, so she might be picking up on some of these ideas. This essay, again, think of it as a Gothic cathedral, is an eclectic mixture of high and low, grotesque and sublime, old and new, gravity and levity, vaulting light and clarity, cramped darkness and crypticism, gargoyle and seraph. Every niche and alcove of the essay is densely packed with quotations from and allusions to not only the Bible and Shakespeare and English and German romantics, medieval and Renaissance poets, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Thomas Carlyle, but also contemporary news stories about sinister murders, an Edinburgh detective on the hunt, references to Darwinian evolution and Greek mythology, to pterodactyls and seashells, geology and algebraic proofs, bodybuilding advice and the rise of gym culture, Arthurian romance and the Arabian Nights, lexicography, linguistics, painting, music, botany, the scientific method, home education, women's rights, pneumatology, ecology, literary criticism, and, all important, who a woman should marry. So in preparation for this talk, I made a list, and I went through and I followed MacDonald's game of hide and seek and traced every single reference that I could, and made a list as far as this was possible. I won't go through them all, though again I would enjoy that. You can see, and I guess the thing to point out here is that I think this snapshot helps us to imagine MacDonald's imagination. Obviously, there's loads more we could add into this. Dante's not there, and you could list all the things that aren't on the list as well. But it does give us a good idea. The Bible, obviously, is the bedrock, the substratum that provides structure and support to all the rest. Next comes the pillar of Shakespeare, second only to the Bible, as Joe Rickey and Amanda Vernon might tell us more about later on in the week. But then, before even Wordsworth or Novalis, comes a surprise, perhaps, Francis Bacon, who maybe not all of us are familiar with, but Francis Bacon is basically the father of empiricism and the scientific method. And this before a lot of these other figures that you might think that he would have gone for. We must not forget, as Fran Colt and various other people at this conference might talk about. I'll just promote Fran because it's this book right here, which I'm not promoting my book. I'm just promoting the fact that Fran happens to have a chapter in this book. Fran has a lovely chapter in which she talks about science and MacDonald and points out how much MacDonald was immersed in science throughout his life, not just the fact that he was a university-educated scientist who initially had aspirations of becoming a research chemist, but carried on with that throughout his life and is everywhere in his works. Then after Bacon, we have the Romantic poets, both English and German, Renaissance poets, Malory, Chaucer, and a whole host of contemporary and ancient references. As Trevor Hart recently said in a Zoom meeting, that MacDonald is in many ways a polymath, and that's one of the best ways to describe him. He was deeply knowledgeable about an expansive range of disciplines and writers, and he drew upon them all in this essay to demonstrate how pervasive the imagination is in all human endeavors under the sun. Two things before I properly start sketching the spiritual scaffolding of this Gothic cathedral. First, as I've pointed out, you've all hopefully been given or collected your crayons. And you've also been given a sheet of paper with an inscription, a Greek inscription on it. What I would like you to do, to facilitate you growing a little bit more childlike in the next few minutes and over the course of this conference, while I am metaphorically sketching this essay for us, I want you to sketch or doodle on your sheet, or again, do whatever it is that you like to do, but play around with your colors and enjoy it. Maybe you want to do what Dante Gabriel Rossetti did when he was sitting in front of MacDonald's lecture. This is one of my favorite images. Rossetti, this is owned by Christopher MacDonald, who kindly let us use it. And you can see on the side of a program, so you can do this on a program too, I suppose. On the back side of this, he doodled George MacDonald during one of the lectures. And again, you heard I've written a book on doodles, so it's something I've been thinking about a lot recently. And I was very happy to be able to include this image in that book. But what I want to point out about doodling, it's not always symptomatic of boredom. Most people sort of think you doodle when you're bored. But there's a lot of recent research which suggests that doodling can actually aid concentration, particularly if you're listening to something. And if it's visual, it's probably less so. But if the main thing that you're trying to do is listen, then doodling can actually be a great aid to memory. But in any case, you now have my permission to doodle away throughout my entire talk. If you feel like doing a caricature of me, that's fine. But you could doodle an image of MacDonald if you felt like, or just draw some pretty pictures. Second, very quickly, one thing I just had to include because it didn't really fit, but I wanted to talk about it. When MacDonald is giving advice about how to develop your imagination, he says two words: food and exercise. He then gives what basically sound like bodybuilding tips. If you want strong arms, he says, take animal food and row. Feed your imagination with food convenient for it and exercise it, not in the contortions of the acrobat, but in the movements of the gymnast. So he sounds to me sort of prophetically like a fitness influencer on social media. You know, to get ripped, you got to eat meat and pump some iron or something like that. I was initially puzzled by the comparison to acrobats and gymnasts, thinking, don't they both sort of tumble around and just contort themselves into weird shapes? But it was actually sort of a thing, which Kirsten pointed out to me, that there was a sort of craze for gyms at the time. So when MacDonald says gymnast, he actually means people who go to the gym. And this was an example of a home gym, some exercises which look very similar to things that you could do at your local gym if you want to try them out. But this one is the one that's even more interesting. This is 1865, so basically probably the year that he was maybe writing, and I think as John McNeill sort of pointed out, probably giving versions of this speech. He was also in Edinburgh when this opened. This is a gymnasium that opened in Edinburgh that year and has this crazy sort of, they call it the sea serpent. It was a rowing machine that actually went round and round in circles, and they could go, as they said, as fast as a steam engine if they really pushed at it. And there's all the other fun things going on there in the background. Anyway, but what MacDonald is basically doing is giving us a metaphorical exhortation that this is what we should be doing with our imagination. We should be playing around, and it's, this is sort of, to me, it's sort of part amusement park, part obstacle course, part training ground. That's the metaphor that he's kind of using for that. Anyway, but on to the essay properly. The first obstacle on our course to understanding and greater enjoyment is the title. At least it was for me. The imagination, its functions, and its culture. The subtitle hasn't aged very well, and if it ever was a very enticing title even to the Victorians. It lacks a certain sex appeal, we might say, if we're allowed to say that here at Wheaton, which as a former grad I'm still a little bit anxious about. But the sex appeal that the fantastic imagination has, right? As I mentioned at the beginning, the fantastic imagination drew me. It appealed to me. That essay, the essay itself is ironic and polished and brief, and its title called to me, and I think I read that essay multiple times before I actually finished. I tried reading Fantasties and failed like 3 times, and tried a few other things and failed too. But that essay I kept reading, and eventually sort of it drew me in. It's probably the reason why I chose to study MacDonald for my PhD. Anyway, that has an alluring, evocative title, but its function and its culture sounds dry, clinical, bureaucratic to our ears. Functions makes me think of, I don't know, Microsoft Excel or business proposals or something along those lines. Dull, uninspiring, useful things. Whereas culture, and I know a lot of people have this misunderstanding, it wasn't just me, thankfully, sounds like you're talking about societal conventions or those people who are pretentious about high art or something like that. So there's an irony in the fact that the title doesn't capture your imagination, right? It doesn't sort of call, at least it didn't call to me, maybe I shouldn't say it doesn't call to you. Silly as it sounds, I think it's actually the primary reason, the title, that I didn't really engage with this essay as much as I probably should have in my PhD, since it's doing exactly what I wanted to do. Yet, function did not pick up its bureaucratic, mechanistic connotations until the 20th century. And culture has nothing to do with society in this context. As a keen linguist, MacDonald is playing with the older meanings of both words. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, one of the earliest definitions of function, particularly when pluralized, was a duty attached to a role, or the performance of a role, unifying the sense of duty with delight, with the delight of performing a role. Meanwhile, the original meaning of culture was the action or practice of cultivating the soil, and then by metaphorical extension, the cultivation or development of the mind through education and training. So, a clearer and slightly more attractive paraphrase for modern ears might be the imagination, its roles, and its cultivation. The 42-page essay breaks into these two parts. So that's the sort of rough structure. The first 35 pages are about the purpose, roles, duties of the imagination, and the final 7 pages are about how to nurture and develop the imagination towards its proper fulfillment. Before I get to what I see as the vivifying spirit of the essay, that spiritual skeleton that he's sort of talking about, the spirit part of the skeleton, let me quickly sketch the skeleton so that everyone has at least a sense of that overall shape. MacDonald begins with education. He begins by talking about the goal of education. What many educators argue, where many educators argue that the imagination should be suppressed in order to facilitate balanced repose. MacDonald says the goal of education is a noble unrest. And the imagination is the best faculty for enabling this noble unrest. The imagination, he defines the imagination as imaging or making of likenesses, and it is the faculty in humanity that is closest to the creative power of God. Yet, MacDonald goes out of his way to emphasize the unpassable gulf that distinguishes God's primary creation from nothing, or rather from inside God's self, as Trevor Hart emphasizes in his contribution in Amanda and I's book, from what humans do with the imagination. All creation, all science, all history, every human is a thought of God, and his imagination made flesh, which again I think Trevor Hart might be telling us a little bit more about on Friday morning. Thus, every thought in every human mind has its ultimate source in God, the Father of lights, one of MacDonald's favorite names for God. Creation, nature, and history are all, he says, quote, the inexhaustible storehouse of forms, from which humans can select to illuminate their thoughts. Human imagination can assemble new combinations of these forms and can reveal new interpretations of these forms. But humans cannot create in the primary sense like God can. For this reason, MacDonald doesn't like the word poet as much. He does like it a bit, but not as much as a lot of people. Because it means maker, and he's wary of that metaphor. It too readily suggests that humans have created something entirely new in the way that God does. Rather, he prefers the French trouvère. Our French isn't very good, but I think that's how you say it, which means finder. After providing poetic examples of how poets like Shelley recombine forms found in nature to reveal a new insight or interpretation of human experience and understanding, death in Shelley's case, MacDonald explores how the imagination is essential, not just to literature and the arts, as we probably would expect, but to all aspects of human endeavor, discussing and giving examples from language and philology, science, history, biography, mathematics, detective work, choosing a spouse, home economics, as we sort of pointed out before. He goes into most depth on language, science, history, and literature. Starting with language, he observes how nearly all human language is a product of the imagination. Through the finding of apt metaphors, or through the making of metaphors. A metaphor is what enables one person to share, to make a connection, to make a link with another human being, and brings to life a feeling on the inside. For science, he says that imagination is the far-seer, the intellect. So the imagination is the far-seer, the architect, are some of the images he used, while the intellect is the workman that checks and confirms and does the sort of the hard labor along the way. But the imagination is the originator of hypotheses and the generator of the questions without which science would be helpless. And here I'll just quickly reference Tom McLeish, who sadly passed away last year, who is a professor of physics and natural philosophy, who's talked about this and very much excited about MacDonald. And Carey as well is also a scientist who has this sort of passion about the imagination's role in science. In history, MacDonald talks about both in human history and natural history. The imagination gathers, it finds, it gathers these fragments. And from these fragments, from these hints and guesses, it reconstructs a picture of the whole. Even more importantly, though, even than all these, the way it manifests itself in all these different disciplines, he argues that the imagination cannot be suppressed. Don't try to suppress it. It can't be suppressed. If it doesn't work for good, it will work for evil, or for merely selfish, sensuous purposes. Thus, the imagination is also the source, or at least one with our hopes, our aspirations, and our moral intuitions. Having established, then, the ubiquity of the imagination in human affairs and the vital significance of cultivating it, he then concludes the essay by advising how to develop it. I've already quoted his two-word summary of this: food and exercise. With food, he discusses observing nature, sort of a Charlotte Mason-style education, as well as studying the best books with the help of a wise teacher. And by exercise, the primary thing he means is doing good, as in behaving morally and doing what your conscience is sort of calling you to. But he also means being challenged by the reading of good books and other works of the imagination, art, and music, etc. This, as I said, is just the skeleton. It doesn't do the essay justice by any means. But even the skeleton of this essay is daring and aspirational, particularly in the way MacDonald draws attention to the role of the imagination in surprising areas like science, history, the development of language, morality, and daily life. At least since the Romantics, poets had claimed the power of the imagination for poets and elevated poets to be the unacknowledged legislators of the world, in Shelley's triumphal phrase. But MacDonald does more than anyone I am aware of to democratize the imagination, to delineate its less showy but no less essential significance in nearly every aspect of human life. As MacDonald says, if the imagination be to man what creation is to God, we must expect to find it operative in every sphere of human activity. Such is indeed the fact, and that to a far greater extent than is commonly supposed. What this means is that the imagination is not just vital for poets and artists, but it is fundamental to being human and to connecting with the divine. And we are therefore under a powerful obligation to develop the imagination to its utmost, no matter if we are a politician, a plumber, or a poet. But what I see as the spirit of the essay, thinking about the spiritual scaffolding, the vivifying principle that gives life to the whole, is even, in my view, more amazing and joyfully liberating. It is summed up in one phrase that we've already heard a couple times from the conclusion of the essay. Thus, to be playfellows with God in this game. It is, I think, the spirit of play that dances and sings in this essay, and I would argue throughout all of MacDonald's works. And it is the spirit of play, therefore, that informs and epitomizes MacDonald's idea of the prophetic imagination. To imagine MacDonald's imagination rightly, therefore, we need to understand, or at least, he might not want us to fully understand it, at least to begin to play along with the spirit, MacDonald's spirit of play. So I think there are several implications of calling humans playfellows with God in this game. The first is that humans, at their highest, that is, when they are fulfilling their divinely ordained purpose most completely, are best described as players. I think it is highly likely that MacDonald is here influenced by Friedrich Schiller, who wasn't actually quoted in the essay, but I do think MacDonald was very familiar with Schiller, and I think would have been familiar with this book on the aesthetic education of man. In this, Schiller writes, "Humans play only when they are in the full sense of the word human. And they are only wholly human when they are playing." In other words, the proper name for humanity should not be Homo sapiens, the human as thinker, nor, as many poets and artists or political thinkers like Hannah Arendt might prefer, Homo faber, the human as maker, but Homo ludens, the human as player. MacDonald frequently depicted the highest form of human actualization as when work becomes play, or when the two become united, as he does, for example, in the first part of the Scottish fairy tale, The Carousewing, when Colin first has to dream for 3 nights in a row, then work for 3 nights in a row, before finally working and dreaming together for 3 nights in a row, which is ultimately what allows him to produce the magical wine that helps him defeat the evil fairy queen. Imagining humanity at its highest as Homo ludens rather than Homo sapiens or Homo faber is superior in MacDonald's view for several reasons. First, and perhaps primarily, because it undercuts the insidious seriousness that seems to infect most human activities, and which tends to inflate the ego with pride and to cause the self to cling tightly to possessions and things, which it too readily labels as mine. A good example here, and there's nearly infinite number in MacDonald, is The Wise Woman, where the Princess Rosamund has to learn that in order to make the flowers grow, rather than die when she touches them, she has to learn she cannot try to seize and possess them and own them. But once she learns this, she can lightly touch them and transfigure them into radiantly beautiful things. One of the things I love about MacDonald's imagination is how little he seems to suffer from what Harold Bloom calls the anxiety of influence, by which Bloom means the struggle to overcome, escape, or obscure the influence of the thinkers and writers that most profoundly shaped one. So think of Milton striving to overcome or critique the classical epic tradition, or Wordsworth and Coleridge breaking with the poetry of the 18th century, or Tolkien distancing himself from MacDonald and the Victorian fairy tale tradition, one of my pet peeves. Particularly after the Romantic definition of the poet as a genius whose work had to be original and unique in order to have value. Most artists are very anxious about originality and worry that they are unconsciously imitating someone else. But MacDonald is always unembarrassed about how much he has playfully found in other writers. Because he conceives of the imagination not as the serious, original poet, or Homo faber, but rather as Homo ludens, he is always lightly and playfully redirecting his readers back to the older sources that he has found so beautiful and inspiring. And the emphasis is never on the I. It is not, look what I have found, but look what I have found. The emphasis is on the looking, the wondering at the thing, and the delightful surprise of having found, rather than on the self for finding. We'll be experiencing lots of this. I think Rebecca Reynolds will be highlighting an aspect of this with Spencer, MacDonald's Delight, and Edward Spencer tomorrow, and many of our panel papers will be exploring lots of other ways in which MacDonald playfully drew on influences, and again, he does it in such a way that you don't have to work as hard as you do with a lot of other writers to distinguish what he's actually doing. He was not anxiously hiding these influences to promulgate his originality and his importance, but joyfully sharing them like a child. Look at this, look at this. Homo ludens is more joyful and lighthearted than Homo faber, with its emphasis on struggle and labor and conflict and originality. And it's more relational and communal than Homo sapiens, with its solitary, solipsistic tendencies. Play is not just life-affirming, but something like the spirit that animates, that moves the body. And Malcolm Geit is going to be discussing more about a heart that is fully alive tomorrow, and how, and we'll probably be talking to us a little bit more about this aspect of him. So after the phrase, towards the end of this section, after the phrase playfellows with God in this game, MacDonald juxtaposes the little ones, which I think is a nice anticipation of Lilith, which maybe Malcolm might be talking about as well, the little ones gathering their daisies and following their painted moths, and gathering from the leafless hawthorn ruddy with the stores God has laid up for them. With the man, so he compares the little ones, those little ones, to the man of science, who is rightly spelling every star and every herb until old experience do attain to something like prophetic strain. MacDonald links these two seemingly, surprisingly disparate endeavors, the child playing with flowers to the old scientist hard at work. But the culmination of the labor of science is not a Homo faber-like making of new tools or arts or technologies, nor a Homo sapiens-like achievement of greater intellectual mastery and control, but a Homo ludens-esque attaining to something like prophetic strain. The word strain is deliciously ambiguous in my mind and could mean, and I should note, obviously this is Milton, not MacDonald saying this, but this is another way that MacDonald is playing. He doesn't end his essay with himself. He ends his essay with somebody else. And he played, even in that play, he helped me see what was going on in Milton better. And there's a sense in which he's interpreting Milton even just by quoting Milton in this weird sort of way. So strain could be is a very ambiguous word. It could mean stress, or it could also mean force or current, or it can also mean musical harmony, and seems in a weird sort of way to indicate all three, and that we're not getting the Homo faber kind of stress and strain, or the Homo sapiens, we've discovered a new power that we can master, but that all three are unified and brought into a higher relationship with that sense of musical harmony. Prophecy, thus, so again, just to note, prophetic imagination, our essay ends with this idea of the prophetic imagination, prophetic strain. Prophecy, thus, is also playful. If humanity at its highest is Homo ludens, then play ought to be present even in what appears to be one of humanity's most solemn, serious, and portentous modes. Prophetic figures in MacDonald's fiction often have a ludic lightness to them that baffles and confuses the characters who are caught up in what MacDonald liked to call the commonplace, by which he meant something like worldliness, selfishness, and the ambition to get and acquire things. Characters like Diamond from At the Back of the North Wind and Gibbie from Sir Gibbie treat the things and concerns of this world lightly and playfully, and as a result, they have the prophetic vision to see the things that ultimately matter and to see through the things that don't. Playfully rewriting the biblical texts, it's another very provocative thing to do, to rewrite the Bible. Which is sort of quoted in both Joel and Acts, MacDonald exhorts his readers, seek not that your sons and daughters should not see visions, should not dream dreams, don't suppress the imagination. Seek that they should see true visions, that they should dream noble dreams. Such outgoing of the imagination is one with aspiration, and will do more to elevate above what is low and vile than all possible inculcations of morality. Focus on the imagination, and the conscience will come. Here again, we see MacDonald democratizing the prophetic imagination. Poets aren't a special class. Everyone, not just poets and artists, should be seeking to see true visions and dream noble dreams. This joyfully liberates them from the commonplace vision that is imposed upon them by the structures of power and consumption in this world. MacDonald, I think, would have agreed with Walter Brueggemann in his book on the prophetic imagination, which might come up a few times. I think John Paziora is definitely going to mention it, that the imagination Brueggemann. The imagination must come before the implementation. Our culture is competent to implement almost anything and to imagine almost nothing. The same royal consciousness, and by that he means the power, the government, the king, that kind of thing. The same royal consciousness that makes it possible to implement anything is the one that shrinks imagination, because imagination is a danger. Every totalitarian regime is frightened of the artist. Again, I think MacDonald would have very much agreed with Brueggemann here, but I also think he would want to shift it into what he sees as the higher, more ludic register. Not just speaking truth to power, as we hear about, but speaking play to power, or even just playing with the truth and the goodness that one finds around one, and trusting in God for the transformative power that will have on the self, on others, and on society. John Pazdiora is going to be telling us more about prophetic seeing in just a couple of hours. He likes, in Alec Forbes, he often likes to play the gravitas to my levitas, so we will see if he checks me in some way in a couple of hours. But to return to the phrase, playfellows with God in this game, there is a further, more radically playful indication in that phrase. If humanity is homo ludens, so that the highest function of the imagination, our highest faculty, is to be playfellows with God, then God must also have play as the highest manifestation of himself. Not just homo ludens, the human as player, but deus ludens, God as player. MacDonald describes God as playing in every sphere of creation and human experience in this essay. He says, God constructs a drama. He begins with the building of the stage itself, and that stage is a world, a universe of worlds. He makes the actors. He utters them into the visible to work out their life, his drama. Instead of writing his lyrics, he sets his birds and his maidens a-singing. All the processes of the ages are God's science. All the flow of history is his poetry. His sculpture is not in marble, but in living and speech-giving forms. God plays all the roles, dramatist, poet, sculptor, historian, scientist, singer, because he delights in playing. According to MacDonald's extended image of the imagination as trouvère, or finder, as we discussed, life is one big epic game of hide and seek, with God playing the hiding role and humans playing the finding role, which I love as an inversion, which you always hear about, of deus abscondus, is, that a lot of atheists always like to talk about. He flips that around and turns it into a playful aspect of God's self. He says the imagination has a duty altogether human, which is paramount to that function. The duty, namely, which springs from his immediate relationship to the Father, that of following and finding out the divine imagination. This game of hide and seek is both duty and delight. It unites duty and delight in the highest playful harmony. In one of MacDonald's most playful unspoken sermons, The Child in the Midst, which was first published in 1867, which I think was a very significant year for MacDonald with the imagination for many reasons. MacDonald makes the same point when he insists that Jesus' injunction to become little children tells us not only that the highest human state is to become childlike, but that this is only true because God himself is childlike. For it is his childlikeness that makes him our God and our Father, MacDonald says. Having had a classical education in Greek, MacDonald would have known that the Greek word for child is paideia, and that it's the same word that also means play or game. So we could playfully rewrite MacDonald's assertion this way: for it is his playfulness that makes him our God and our Father. And MacDonald gives us a prophetically imaginative picture of this deus ludens many places. Probably my favorite is The Old Man of the Fire from The Golden Key, also published in 1867. Having thrown herself plumb down a steep waterslide, Tangle finds herself in a burning, mossy chamber where she sees a little naked child playing with colored balls, who goes on busily, tirelessly playing his solitary game. And for 7 years, Tangle stood there watching the naked child with his colored balls. This is the oldest man of all, the deepest, highest revelation of God as a child playing a game. This prophetic imagining of Deus Ludens also corrects some of the typical fears and worries that people have when people like me start talking about play as the highest function of humanity and the highest manifestation of the divine. Play is not lawless, slovenly, or selfish. In fact, the full sentence from which the title of our conference is taken is, quote, "The laws we claim for the prophetic imagination." Does the same thing in fantastic imagination as well. A little later on, he goes on even further in our essay. "More than this, we dare to claim for the true, childlike, humble imagination such an inward oneness with the laws of the universe that it possesses in itself an insight into the very nature of things." In other words, a true player, precisely because they want to be great at the game and maximize their joy in playing, learns and intuits the rules and laws until they become instinctual. Think about a paragon player in your favorite sport or game or art. They have the laws of that game imbued in every muscle fiber and every sense organ. A prima ballerina feels the perfection of a circle in every pirouette. A professional pool player intuits the angles and geometry of every shot. A skilled photographer instinctually frames the world around the rule of thirds and other mathematical principles, echoing the harmony of mathematical ratios. And play at these highest levels is only achieved through self-sacrifice, discipline, effort, careful attention to detail, losing oneself in the pursuit of something higher. The closest I ever came to this was in playing lacrosse, when my mind and my body seemed to harmonize for just, probably 3 seconds in my whole life with the rhythms of the game and my teammates, and you had that perfect pass and that perfect catch and that perfect shot. I'm sure you have a similar experience in whatever area that might be for yourself. That exquisite lightness of being, of those pinnacle moments of play, can only come after hundreds, probably thousands in my case, of hours of throwing a ball against a wall. Diligent, meticulous practice. And of course, we shouldn't forget, add to the list of players, scholars, academics, enthusiasts. We are all here to play a great game. The game of imagining MacDonald's prophetic imagination. The great thing about conceiving our time together as a game, as Kirsten has already done calling us playfellows, is that it reduces that feeling of self-importance and personal possessiveness that we might have, maybe towards MacDonald, and hopefully, therefore, increases our delight, our joy, and the beauty of the whole experience. If you're not as possessive about it, you get the delightful, playful experience. There's always a danger at these academic conferences of people feeling possessive over ideas or insights or texts or authors. But as Diamond would remind us, love makes the only minus. So hopefully in our time playing together, we can take things lightly, which, as Chesterton remarks, is the only reason why angels can fly. So, to help us and to inflesh, to make manifest this spirit of play and levity, if you haven't already done some doodles on your sheet of paper, I want you to spend a little bit of time, and maybe, I'm not sure how much time, do we have much time for questions, Kirsten? I'm not sure what we're doing.
Yeah, we'll take a couple quick questions.
Okay.
Danny, yeah.
So, we have a couple quick questions. Finish off your drawings. On this sheet, just to give you a little bit of context, you've got a Greek inscription, which Epipteonta, if my Greek's not great, but it is the Greek inscription from Homer, which means, it's translated winged words. And it's what would be said at the end of a speech in the Iliad, the Odyssey, and it meant sort of speaking it. MacDonald used it quite a few times in 1867. He also, interestingly, inverted it for unspoken sermons. So it's the epigraph inverted to unspoken sermons. If you look at the title page of unspoken sermons, it's unwinged words is the the epigraph to that. But we're going to sort of make that manifest. Oh, it's also, I also should mention, it's also what we're doing here, right? So Louisa MacDonald called MacDonald's sermons and speeches his winged words. So we are here together to wing our words to one another. So we're going to do that in a semi-literal fashion. Once you finish your drawings, or you could write a quotation, a favorite quotation from MacDonald or elsewhere, or draw a picture, whatever you want to do in the final minutes before we conclude here. Do that, and then when you're ready, you're gonna make a paper airplane. Okay, and we will wing our words in a moment. But if we want to do questions, what are we doing?
Sure. I think people can fold their airplanes while we're asking questions. And Danny, as I look down at my words, because I am a word-dependent person here, thank you so much for helping draw us deeper into and help us understand better how MacDonald calls us to be more fully human by stewarding our imagination better, participating in imagination, by being more imaginative beings. He's calling us into being more who God calls us to be, more fully human. So thank you for doing that so beautifully and challenging our intellect as well as our heart with that. It's really beautiful. And Danny reminded me of two things that really struck me while I was listening to him. One, when I wrote an essay or an article on MacDonald once, the copy editor changed a sentence for the published version that I didn't see. And I wrote something about MacDonald's calling us into the imagination. And the copy editor put in the sentence afterwards, I want to weave this into a question for you. She added to my text, but not a wild imagination. Which gutted me, because that was what went out in the printed form. And I did not see that till afterwards, but not a wild imagination. So I'll leave that with you for a second, because I want to ask you a question about that. But also you reminded me how Ruskin talks about, he writes in an accolade for MacDonald, I know of no one, I'm not going to quote this perfectly, but I know of no one who loves literature better than you do. Other writers love themselves and how they interpret literature, but I know of no one who actually loves story and literature more than you do, George MacDonald. So back to my quick question, the imagination to set up others. And you touched on this in a sense, but you talked about the imagination going dangerous if we don't, in Lady Macbeth, repress or imagination. But can an imagination be too wild?
That's going to depend on your definition of wild, isn't it? So, yeah, if wild means Lady Macbeth, let's murder somebody, and then yes, obviously the imagination can go wild.
Or is that a repressed? Is that?
Well, yeah, I mean, so, and again, I think if you mean by wild, sort of maybe not restricted by societal conventions, I think absolutely MacDonald would very much encourage wildness. In this essay, he talks again. This is the marriage advice to women is do not basically give in to the conventions that society is trying to push on you for who you should marry. Yeah. So in that sense, he's telling them to go wild.
Yeah, go wild. He is.
But he's not telling them to go wild in the sense of liberate every single urge and emotion that you might have. It's and this is why I think the image of the game is I think works well, because games come with rules, and I think when I watch my girls play, there is always even if they haven't defined it, there's an implicit set of rules that are in place in order for play to work. Certainly in order for humans to play with each other. Maybe you could play by yourself potentially, I guess, without very many rules. Although that isn't very much fun, right? So in order for play to be fun, there has to be rules. Now then you can go wild within the boundaries of those rules, I think is the best way to think of it. And within the boundaries of those rules, not some other imposed rules from outside, with the rules that the game itself brings, not society or others or ambition or something else that is imposing those things. So yes, go wild, but go wild in the sense that like a great basketball player goes wild in the game. They don't start hitting people. They're not going wild in that way. Those are fouls. They go wild by being the absolute best player on the court. Yeah.
That's cool. First, before we ask questions, Danny, thank you so much. questions, and we'll make the time work here, so don't stress about that.
This may be associative thinking, but when you were talking, I was thinking of the theologian John Piper talks about Christian hedonism. And so when you were talking about play, I was thinking of pleasure. And is this a kind of a Christian hedonistic view of the world?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I would argue it's a slightly better version than just focusing on pleasure. Again, partially because, as I was just saying, I think play, as MacDonald would say, play comes with rules. And so the problem, the slight problem, I've read Piper, that book, and it had a big impact on me at one point. But I think that's what I would say, that play is more than just pleasure. It's not just pleasure. It also, as I said, to achieve those singular moments of absolute, where you sort of feel disassociated from your body almost, or you feel like your body is sort of in perfect unity with everything. Yes, of course it's a pleasure, but it also took all this, like, again, my lacrosse, it took all this. At the end of that, I was exhausted. It was like, it's sort of drained out of you, and it was painful and difficult along the way. So that's why it's not just pleasure, I guess is what I say. But yes, it's along the same, into the lines.
Sure.
Not so much a question, just a spin on that, and that's to suggest that the word is joy, not pleasure. I think joy is pleasurable, but lots of things are pleasurable, but don't necessarily have joy involved.
Yeah.
I think joy is the word probably
There's a question at the back there, and then John.
One of the major elements that Schiller quote about human beings are the ones who play, the homo ludens, but animals do play as well. I don't want to take the metaphor too far, but how would we respond to the idea that play isn't a distinct human thing, at least biologically?
I don't see a problem with that. I don't know if MacDonald would see a problem with that. The fact that all of creation plays, sort of a Hopkins Christ plays in 10,000 places kind of thing, that the play of creation would be, or again, Proverbs 8:30, the Spirit of God plays before God in the creation. I think that would be an echoing of that, and I think we maybe, like, that's a furthering of that. The fact that play connects us to animals, whereas Homo sapiens doesn't connect us to animals. There's a sense in which that connects us further and joins us more intimately to creation, I guess is, I would guess how we'd respond, but who knows?
First of all, Danny, thank you for an excellent paper, a wonderful exposition of the essay and of the ideas behind it. I wanted to sort of ask about something which has puzzled me about this essay, puzzled me about how MacDonald's writing about the imagination. And that it seems like, because you have the list of all these dozens of authors he's quoting from in there, but there's one name which either I didn't see it or it's just, I think it's not there. It's conspicuous by its absence, and that's Charles Dickens. And how much MacDonald is sort of setting up this contrast between this sort of sterile, arid Homo sapiens and the imaginative, playful Homo ludens, as you're saying.
Yeah.
And yet that's the dichotomy which Dickens puts forward so powerfully in Hard Times. And I'm wondering why, partly I'm wondering why MacDonald doesn't sort of go to Dickens as natural. Dickens is sort of already putting this idea forward. And how do you see the connection between what MacDonald is saying in The Imagination, Its Functions and Culture, and what Dickens is doing in Hard Times and elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you're right, MacDonald doesn't talk a lot about Dickens either here, or as much as maybe you might expect him to, given the popularity of Dickens at the time. I think, A Christmas Carol is another example of that sort of thing as well. I suppose Dickens, I don't want to criticize Dickens too much, but it's certainly, although he's certainly Christian in some respect, I think it's less overtly so. And it's probably more sort of manifesting in Dickens without the full intellectual apparatus sort of around it, and he doesn't have a theology of play. I think Dickens is just sort of doing it. He's not necessarily thinking about it. And at least when I read a lot of things, when Dickens is being more, is not in his fiction mode, it's not as good. That's probably what I would say. And I don't know why MacDonald wouldn't still use it as an example. I mean, it probably would have been. There's some brilliant examples from Hard Times, from Christmas Carol, virtually any Dickens you point to. I don't know. Chesterton certainly picks up that aspect, and maybe it was left for Chesterton to focus on the Dickensian aspect of that.
There was one quick question here. Dang, I see two. Okay, we'll make them quick because we have to be attentive to the others. But yeah, Joe and then Jeff.
Quick one is just, thanks very much, and especially with the aspect of kid democratization of the imagination. I think that's very rich. It's really important for us going forward when we make applications from this, because I think in terms of play as art, there's art that's very not antisocial, but it's God's playfellows is kind of the key. There's a mutuality there, there's sociality there, and there's art that isn't that, or at least not much.
Yeah.
And I think you think about the MacDonald's practice, art in the living room, in the backyard, in the, reading is a reading, but it's interactive. I think it is like, for instance, scroll, these different things. So I really like that aspect of this as we all move forward thinking about this, like applying it to our own culture, into our own practices. Like when we're in the room, back in the dorm later, with our guitars sitting around in a circle, and making art.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And I think it destroys that distinction of high art in a certain respect. That doesn't necessarily, clearly, MacDonald obviously idolizes Shakespeare and Dante and all the rest of it, but yes, would not therefore denigrate what might be seen as lower. But he links the two constantly, the low and the high, as he did at the end of the essay with the scientist who spent his whole life doing that. Presumably he would do the same thing with the artist spending his whole life mastering that perfection of art with the child's doodle, as some of you have hopefully done.
Okay, one last quick question here.
I didn't quite catch the import of your distinction from Tolkien, but I wondered if he shares this intersection of self-forgetfulness, levity, and then seriousness. I don't know if you know of his thoughts on that. I think of when Tom Bombadil is handed the ring by Frodo and he flips it in the air and laughs.
Yeah. Yes. My feelings on Tolkien are always a little bit ambivalent, but not in terms of his artwork, but in terms of his relationship to MacDonald. But absolutely, that moment, I'd say that's his MacDonald moment in The Lord of the Rings. Tom Bombadil is where he actually lets the fullness of the playful part of himself come out, and it's the part that I think connects most closely to his childhood experience of reading MacDonald and reading the Victorian fairy tales that he later goes on to, distance himself from.
But not until he was in his 70s, guys. Not until he was in his 70s.
Well,
Let's.
So yes, last thing then is what I would like you to do is so again we're in fleshing our levity, taking ourselves lightly. You're not going to find yours. Hopefully, you're supposed to collect somebody else's at the end of this. So we're all going to throw our paper airplanes, and then as we go out, you're going to collect somebody else's paper airplane, and it's going to be a prophetic revelation to you, somebody else's imagination. Okay. So ready? 1, 2, 3.